Hey everyone, I've noticed that many of you are enjoying the videos, but most of you haven't subscribed yet. We're super close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support could help us reach that milestone. If you're enjoying the content, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really makes a huge difference and helps us keep creating more awesome content. Thank you so much for watching and supporting. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires louder than usual. Something about the house looked different, almost unwelcoming. Emily was sitting on the front porch steps, her small shoulders hunched, her hair falling over her face like a veil. She looked up, startled, when I stepped out of the car. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she quickly wiped them with the back of her hand. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. "Hey, kiddo," I said softly, trying to hide the concern building in my chest. "What's wrong?" "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice cracking. She looked around nervously, as if afraid someone might hear her. "Yeah, it's me. Why are you out here by yourself?" Her lips trembled, and then, in a rush, she blurted out, "Why is Uncle Robert always here?" "I heard Mom say he's my real dad." The words hung in the air, slicing through the quiet evening like a blade. I froze, the world around me shifting. The lawn, the front porch, the familiar scent of freshly cut grass, all of it faded into the background. My mind grasped at her words, twisting them around, trying to make them mean something else. Something, anything, other than what they sounded like. But there was no other interpretation. "Emily, what are you talking about?" My voice sounded strange, like it belonged to someone else. She shrank back, curling into herself as if expecting me to lash out. I, I heard Mom talking on the phone," she stammered. "She was mad, said you didn't need to know, and that Robert should take responsibility, because he's my real dad." "I didn't mean to listen, Daddy, I swear." I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and I had to remind myself to keep it together. Not here, not in front of her. "It's okay, sweetheart," I managed to say, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "You did nothing wrong. Why don't you go inside and I'll be right there?" She nodded, looking unsure, but didn't argue. As she slipped inside the house, I stood there, feeling the ground shift beneath me. It felt like my entire life was splintering apart, and I hadn't even stepped through the front door yet. When I finally entered the house, Linda was in the kitchen, humming softly as she chopped vegetables. The sight of her, so calm, so ordinary, made my blood boil. How could she pretend everything was normal? "Hey," I called out, keeping my voice level. She looked up, a smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "James, you're back early. How was your trip?" I glanced around the room, noting every detail like a detective at a crime scene. There it was, her phone locked and face down on the counter. A men's watch sat next to it, a watch I'd never seen before. "It was fine," I said flatly. "What's Robert's watch doing here?" Linda's eyes flickered just for a second, but it was enough. "Oh, he dropped by earlier, must have left it behind," she said with a casual shrug. Too casual. "I'll give it back to him next time I see him." Liar. My chest tightened. I could still hear Emily's voice, the way she'd said, "my real dad." I wanted to shout, to grab her by the shoulders and demand she tell me the truth. But I forced myself to stay calm, to smile back like nothing had changed. "Yeah, make sure you do." We ate dinner together, a quiet tension lingering between us. I barely tasted the food. My thoughts kept circling back to Emily's words, the watch, and the way Linda's fingers kept twitching whenever her phone buzzed. I tried to remember the last time things had felt normal between us. It was like trying to remember a dream after waking up, blurry and disjointed. Had I missed the signs, or had I ignored them? After dinner, I made an excuse to go for a walk, needing to clear my head. But as I wandered aimlessly through the neighborhood, I realized there was no clarity to be found. My mind raced, playing out countless scenarios. Was it true? Had she been lying to me all these years? When I returned, Linda was on the phone in the living room, speaking in low, hushed tones. The way she lowered her voice when she saw me set off alarms in my head. She glanced up, met my gaze for a split second, and turned away, her voice dropping even further. I strained to catch bits of the conversation. Oh, no, he doesn't know anything. I'm handling it. Don't worry. I clenched my fists, forcing myself not to react. It took everything in me to walk past her without a word and head to my office. There, I locked the door behind me and sat down heavily at my desk. Linda's words echoed in my mind. He doesn't know anything. But I knew enough, and that was the problem. The next few days were a blur of feigned normalcy. I watched Linda more closely than ever before. Every interaction, every glance, every message she sent on her phone. I noticed things I hadn't before, how she'd turn her body away when texting, how she'd always take her phone with her even when she left the room for a few minutes. Late one night, when she finally fell asleep, I grabbed her phone. My heart pounded as I tried different passcodes, birthdays, anniversaries, anything I could think of. On the fifth attempt, it unlocked. Relief surged through me, followed by a sickening feeling of dread. The messages were there, dozens of them, all from Robert. I scrolled through the conversations, each message tightening the noose around my throat. It wasn't just an affair, it was a relationship. They'd been together for years. They'd shared moments, secrets, things I hadn't known. And then I saw it, a message that froze my blood. We need to talk about Emily. He's starting to suspect. What if he finds out she's mine? The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the floor. I stared at it, my chest heaving, my hands trembling with a fury I could barely contain. Emily, my Emily, might not be mine at all. I stumbled out of the office and into the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before I heaved. Rage and grief churned in my stomach, warring for dominance. This wasn't just betrayal, this was annihilation. They destroyed my life, my family, everything I'd believed in. How long had they been laughing behind my back? By the time I straightened up and looked at myself in the mirror, something inside me had shifted. The man staring back at me wasn't the same one who'd walked into this house a few days ago. My eyes were colder, harder. I wiped my mouth, squared my shoulders, and stepped out of the bathroom. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't confront them. Not yet. Not until I had a plan. But I wouldn't be passive. I wouldn't let them walk away unscathed. Linda wanted to lie, to cheat, to rip our family apart? Fine. I'd show her what happens when you play me for a fool. The days that followed were a tangled mess of anxiety and restraint. I forced myself to keep up appearances, to smile, to play the doting husband, to nod along to Linda's empty words as if everything were fine. But every interaction, every fleeting moment with her, felt like a calculated act of betrayal. My mind was a battlefield, torn between keeping my composure and the relentless urge to lash out, to demand answers and end the charade. I found myself scrutinizing every detail, every nuance in her behavior, looking for the cracks I knew were there. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt like walking on shards of glass. Each word was measured, each smile forced, each glance a performance. Linda moved through our home with an air of detachment I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I had, and just hadn't let myself see it. I tried to remember when she'd started pulling away, when her gaze had turned distant, when our words had begun to feel hollow. But those memories blurred together in a haze of denial and disbelief. At night, lying beside her, I listened to her breathing, wondering what secrets lurked behind those closed eyelids. Was she dreaming of him? Of them? My imagination spiraled, feeding on itself, conjuring images of Linda and Robert laughing together, their bodies entwined, the lies they'd spun tightening around me like a noose. I found myself lying awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering when my life had become something barely recognized. One morning, I noticed something that seemed insignificant at first, a hint of a perfume that wasn't hers. It clung to her clothes like a ghost, faint but unmistakable. I'd never smelled it on her before, and I knew Linda. She wasn't the type to experiment with new fragrances. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened. It was another crack, another clue that she wasn't who I thought she was. But confronting her would have been pointless. Not yet. I needed more. The following day, I watched as she left the house. I'm going out for lunch with Marcy, she'd said offhandedly, like she was daring me to question her. My mind cataloged the information, storing it away for later. As soon as she was gone, I went to her closet. I rifled through her clothes, her shoes, anything that could tell me where she'd been going. It was methodical, driven by a need to uncover the truth, no matter how small. I found nothing. Frustration gnawed at me, but I refused to give up. I started tracking her movements, making note of her comings and goings. Each time she left, I followed at a safe distance. It didn't take long for the inconsistencies to pile up. Lunches with friends that ended too late. Errands that took twice as long as they should have. Once, she said she'd gone shopping but returned with no bags. And when she got home, I caught a glimpse of her phone screen. There was a message from Robert, just a name and a string of numbers. It was a reservation at a restaurant downtown, one I knew she'd never taken me to. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to rip the truth out of her, but I forced myself to wait. I was learning, cataloging. Every deception, every detail would be ammunition later. The tension between us grew. Every time I looked at her, I felt it. The invisible wall she'd built between us. The coldness of her touch. The way her eyes slid away when I tried to meet them. She was hiding something. I knew it, and she knew I knew. But she kept playing the role of the dutiful wife, the loving mother, as if sheer willpower could erase the cracks splintering beneath the surface. One night, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her slip out of bed. I waited until she was gone, then quietly followed her. She was in the kitchen, her back to me, talking in hushed tones on the phone. I stayed out of sight, straining to hear. "No, it's fine. He's just been acting strange lately. Suspicious. No, he hasn't found anything yet," she murmured, her voice tinged with frustration. I leaned in closer, my pulse pounding in my ears. Who was she talking to? It wasn't Robert's voice on the other end. This one was softer, unfamiliar. It was then I realized she had a network, a whole web of people helping her keep up this deception. The realization hit like a gut punch. I wasn't just up against Linda and Robert. I was up against a coordinated effort, an entire conspiracy built to make me the fool. "Just don't call for a while," she finished, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "I'll let you know when it's safe." I slipped back to bed before she could notice I was gone, my heart racing with a toxic blend of rage and excitement. She was scared. She knew what I was getting closer. The thought fueled me, made me even more determined to uncover everything. My chance came a few nights later. I waited until she was asleep, then grabbed her phone again, this time with more confidence. My fingers moved quickly, entering the passcode she didn't realize I'd seen her use. It unlocked with a soft click, and I began scrolling through her messages. What I found was beyond anything I'd imagined. There were texts to Robert, of course, vile, explicit messages that made my skin crawl. But there were also messages to other numbers, people I didn't recognize, mentions of transferring money, arranging meetings. And then there it was, an exchange that felt like it sucked all the air out of the room. "We need to talk about Emily. He's getting too close. What if he starts digging? Don't worry, he won't find anything. We've covered our tracks." The screen blurred as I stared at those words, their meaning twisting in my gut like a knife. This wasn't just about her affair. They'd planned this, calculated every step to keep me in the dark. And Emily, my Emily, what had they been hiding from me? Who else was in on this? I needed answers, but I needed to be smart, careful. Rushing in now would ruin everything. I turned off the phone and set it back on our nightstand, my mind racing. They'd underestimated me. They thought they were safe, that I was too blind or too naive to piece it all together. I almost smiled at the thought. Let them think they're still in control. Let them think I'm clueless. It would make it all the sweeter when I finally tore their world apart. In the days that followed, I maintained my mask of oblivion. I played the role of the distracted husband, the concerned father, while underneath my resolve hardened. Every glance, every word from Linda was another nail in the coffin of my restraint. I began making plans, reaching out to people who owed me favors, investigators, lawyers, anyone who could help me build a case without raising suspicion. But even as I focused on gathering evidence, a part of me struggled with what I'd found. The betrayal wasn't just physical or emotional, it was a complete erasure of who I thought I was. My marriage, my family, my daughter, they'd all been tainted, twisted into something grotesque by the lies Linda and Robert had built. I felt hollowed out, a shell of the man I used to be. The worst part was looking at Emily. She had no idea what was happening, no idea that her father was unraveling before her eyes. I kept up the act for her sake, but every time she smiled at me, every time she called me Dad, a tiny voice whispered in the back of my mind, "Is it true?" Was she really mine? Or was she the product of their affair, a living testament to their deceit? I needed answers, but I knew that when I finally got them, there'd be no coming back. Whatever I found would break me in a way I wasn't sure I could recover from, but I had no choice. Linda and Robert had taken everything from me, my love, my trust, my family, and they were about to pay for it. I'd make sure of that. I decided I wouldn't confront Linda just yet. I needed time to process, to plan. I knew I was standing at a critical juncture in my life. Whatever I chose to do next would shape everything that followed. One wrong move, and they'd slip through my fingers unscathed. I wasn't going to let that happen. As I watched Linda move through the house, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. This was far from over. I would get the truth, every last piece of it. And when I did, I'd make sure Linda and Robert understood exactly what it meant to betray me. They thought they were safe. They thought I was weak. They were wrong. I spent the next few days in a haze, putting on a mask of normalcy so convincing that even Linda seemed lulled into a false sense of security. Inside, though, I was raging. The betrayal gnawed at my insides like a parasite, but I didn't let it show. My time spent researching divorce attorneys had only confirmed one thing. A standard legal approach wouldn't be enough. It would drag on, cost a fortune, and leave her with a comfortable settlement. No, she needed to lose everything, and so did Robert. I began my preparations by reaching out to a private investigator, a man named Sam I knew from my business circles. Sam had a reputation for digging up dirt on anyone, no matter how well they tried to bury it. After a brief phone call, we agreed to meet in a discreet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. It was late, the place nearly empty, just the way I wanted it. Sam was already there, nursing a cup of black coffee. He looked up as I slid into the booth opposite him, his eyes sharp and assessing. He'd aged since the last time I'd seen him, his once dark hair now flecked with gray, but his gaze hadn't lost its edge. "James," he said, nodding in acknowledgement. "Long time. What's got you calling me out of the blue?" I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I need information, Sam. And I need it fast." "On who?" He sipped his coffee, unruffled by the urgency in my tone. "Robert Townsend and Linda Parker. My wife." The words tasted bitter, but I kept my expression neutral. Sam raised an eyebrow. "That Robert Townsend, CEO of Townsend Enterprises?" "Yeah," I muttered, "that one. He's been screwing my wife for God knows how long, and I want to know everything there is to know about him. I don't care what it costs." His gaze turned speculative. "Everything?" "Everything," I repeated. "His personal life, his finances, his business dealings, especially his business. Find me anything that'll ruin him." Sam nodded slowly, setting his cup down. "And Linda?" "Same," I said, my voice tight. "I want to know where she's hiding money, who she's been talking to, what she's planning. I need to know if she's already filed for divorce, if she's trying to set up a separate life. I want every shred of leverage I can get." A slow smile spread across Sam's face. "You've changed, James. I remember you being a pretty straightforward guy, but now," he whistled softly, "this is something else." I shrugged, fighting to keep the anger in check. "People change, and I'll get on it," he said, sliding a small notepad from his pocket. "But I'll need access. Passwords, phone records, anything that can give me a starting point." I hesitated, then pulled out a piece of paper with Linda's phone passcode and a list of other details I'd managed to collect. Her email, her bank information, even some of Robert's company accounts. I'd spent the last few days compiling as much as I could without arousing suspicion. Sam glanced at the paper, then pocketed it with a satisfied nod. "This should help," he said. "Give me a week, and I'll have something solid for you." "Make it 5 days," I countered. "And I'll double your rate," Sam chuckled. "5 days it is, then. I'll be in touch." With that, I left, feeling a sliver of satisfaction for the first time since this nightmare had started. I was no longer a man spiraling out of control. I was focused, calculating. This wasn't about emotions anymore. It was about strategy. Day 1, the waiting game. The first day after meeting with Sam, I kept to my usual routine. Linda didn't seem to notice anything different, which infuriated me. She was so confident that I'd stay blind, that I'd keep playing the fool, that she didn't even bother to hide her tracks anymore. Her phone would buzz with messages from Robert, and she wouldn't flinch. I made sure not to touch her phone again, though. I couldn't afford to get reckless and tip her off. Instead, I focused on my own preparations. I went through our joint accounts, noting the sudden withdrawals and transfers Linda had been making over the past few months. She was siphoning money, money, likely setting up a nest egg for when she finally left me, but she wouldn't get the chance. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer, a cutthroat divorce attorney known for leaving no stone unturned. He came highly recommended. We discussed our options, but when I mentioned I wanted to strip Linda of everything, custody, finance, reputation, he gave me a hard look. "You sure about this, James? This isn't going to be easy. You've got no proof of wrongdoing yet, no grounds for an airtight case." "Not yet," I agreed. "But I will." Day 2, the first crack. Sam called me late on the second night, his voice crackling through the receiver. "James, I've got something for you. Robert's up to his neck in shady deals." I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of deals?" "Money laundering, fraud, and it looks like he's been using his company as a front for some offshore investments. We're talking millions here. If the feds caught wind of it, he'd be looking at a long prison sentence." The news filled me with a dark sense of satisfaction. "Get me proof." "I'll send you the preliminary findings, but this isn't something you want to tiptoe around. One wrong move, and he'll bury it." "No," I murmured. "He won't. He thinks he's untouchable. He'll slip up." "I'll keep digging," Sam promised. "Oh, and one more thing. Linda's been in touch with a real estate agent. Looks like she's shopping around for a place of her own." I clenched my jaw. "She's planning to leave." "Not just leave," Sam said softly. "She's looking at properties under an LLC. If she moves her assets there, she could cut you out entirely." "Not if I beat her to it," I growled. "Keep me posted." When I hung up, I felt the first real surge of hope. I could use this. If I moved fast enough, I could start liquidating our joint assets, redirecting the funds before she realized what was happening. I pulled up our financial statements, mapping out which accounts I could access without immediate backlash. The offshore ones would take time, but I could start with the smaller ones, the savings, the investments tied to her name. I stayed up until dawn, transferring money into accounts she didn't know existed. It was risky, but I had no choice. If she wanted to play dirty, we'll show you how dirty, so could I. Day 3, playing the game. By the third day, Sam's findings were piling up. Robert wasn't just laundering money, he was linked to organized crime. I stared at the documents Sam had sent over, my mind racing with possibilities. If I leaked this information to the right people, Robert's entire world would crumble. But I needed to be careful. A direct accusation from me would look like a vindictive husband's desperate attempt to smear his wife's lover. No, this had to be anonymous. I needed to make sure there was no traceable connection back to me. I reached out to an old friend at the local newspaper, someone who owed me a favor from a deal I'd helped broker years ago. "I've got a story for you," I told him. "One that'll blow up the front page." He listened quietly as I laid it out, careful not to reveal my involvement. By the time I hung up, he was intrigued enough to start digging on his own. It was only a matter of time before Robert's name hit the headlines. The best part? Robert would have no idea I was behind it. Day 4, the pushback. Linda began to sense something was wrong on the 4th day. Her demeanor shifted. She'd become more guarded, her phone glued to her hand at all times. I caught her making several frantic calls, her voice rising with agitation. "It's all falling apart, Robert. The accounts are frozen. No, I don't know why. He can't know. It's impossible." She was unraveling and I relished it, but I couldn't push too hard, too fast. I needed her to think she still had control, that she could salvage this mess. I watched her, silent and unflinching, as she scrambled to regain her footing. It wasn't until she confronted me that evening that I realized just how much she'd started to suspect. "What's going on, James?" she demanded, crossing her arms. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were wild. "I've noticed some discrepancies in our finances." I shrugged casually, forcing a look of confusion. "What do you mean? I haven't touched anything." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her voice breaking. "I know you've been moving money around." "Why?" I smiled then, a cold, hollow smile that sent a flicker of fear across her face. "Maybe I just wanted to make sure I'm not left out in the cold, Linda. After all, it looks like you've been doing some moving of your own." She blanched, her lips parting in shock. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, speechless. Day 5, the final step. By the 5th day, I was ready. The newspaper had gotten back to me. Robert's financial dealings were splashed across the front page. There were whispers of an investigation, murmurs of subpoenas being issued. His company's stock plummeted overnight. I stood in the kitchen, sipping my coffee as Linda paced back and forth, her phone clutched in her hand. She looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "It's all over the news, Robert," she hissed into the phone. "They're saying you could go to prison. What are we going to do by here?" I watched her, my heart steady, my mind calm. She'd been so sure she'd get away with it. They both had, but now the real game began. Linda's panic had reached a fever pitch. She spent every waking moment on the phone, trying to put out fires that she couldn't even see. I kept my distance, watching with cold satisfaction as her confidence crumbled. The woman who'd once sneered at me, who'd taken my love and ground it into dust beneath her heel, was now a wreck, clinging to the shattered pieces of a life she no longer controlled. On the 6th day, I made my next move. I'd spent the morning contacting our bank, shifting funds, and locking down accounts. Any money left tied to Linda would be inaccessible to her by evening. She'd have no liquidity, no way to maneuver. Everything I did was above board, technically legal, just repositioning marital assets. A courtesy, really, for a wife who'd given up her right to those assets the moment she'd decided to cheat. But my real play came that afternoon. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, who'd drawn up documents that were designed to look like a settlement offer. They weren't, just a set of pages crafted to cause confusion. Linda's lawyer, if she ever got one, would be bogged down for weeks trying to parse through them. Every delay would work in my favor. When I handed Linda the thick envelope of papers, her face twisted into a mixture of fury and fear. "What is this?" she demanded, clutching it like it might explode. "A preliminary settlement offer," I said calmly. "Just trying to get things in order, Linda. It's time to talk about the future." Her eyes widened. "Settlement? What the hell are you talking about, James? I haven't filed for anything." "Maybe not yet," I interrupted. "But we both know that's where this is headed." I watched as she glanced at the envelope, her mind racing. For the first time, she seemed truly unsure of herself. She opened the envelope, her gaze skimming over the first few pages. I saw the exact moment she reached the part about our joint accounts. Her jaw tightened, her fingers trembling slightly. "You can't do this," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh, but I can." I leaned back, arms crossed. "Every dollar in those accounts is accounted for, Linda. There's no your money or my money anymore. There's just the truth." "Truth?" She spat the word out like it tasted foul. "You don't know the first thing about the truth." "Don't I?" I arched an eyebrow. "I know you've been seeing Robert for years. I know you've been funneling money out of our accounts, setting up your little LLC. I know you were planning to leave, to start fresh somewhere else. The color drained from her face, her bravado faltering. I could almost see her mind scrambling for a way to recover, a way to spin this back in her favor. But there was no way out, and she knew it. "What do you want?" she finally asked, voice strained. "What I want?" I laughed softly, the sound devoid of humor. "I want you and Robert to get exactly what you deserve." She stared at me, eyes widening in comprehension. But before she could say anything, my phone buzzed. It was Sam, his timing impeccable. I answered it without breaking eye contact with Linda. "Go ahead," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "It's done," Sam said, his tone clipped and professional. "The authorities have everything they need. Robert's about to have a very bad day." I felt a surge of satisfaction. Good. I hung up and turned back to Linda, whose expression had turned from fear to something close to horror. "What did you do?" she whispered. "I made sure Robert's business dealings are going to get the attention they deserve," I replied casually. "Fraud, money laundering. I'm sure the authorities will have plenty of questions." You can't." She lunged forward, gripping my arm with a desperation that might have moved me once. "He'll lose everything." I looked down at her hand, then back up at her face. "So will you." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Robert's downfall would drag her down too. She'd lose everything she'd tried to build with him, every dollar she'd funneled away, every scheme they'd concocted. And it was all happening because she'd underestimated me, because she thought I'd roll over and let her walk away with everything. "You bastard," she hissed, her voice low and vicious. I just smiled. "It's too late, Linda." The wheels are already in motion. Linda stormed out of the room and I let her go. There was nothing she could do now to change what was coming. Robert's fate was sealed and hers was tied to his. The news breaks. The next morning, the news broke. "Townsend Enterprises CEO under investigation for fraud," the headline read. I'd made sure it was plastered across every major business site. The details leaked meticulously. The article outlined Robert's suspected criminal activities, from funneling money through offshore accounts to tax evasion. It even hinted at his connections to organized crime, an accusation that would make any potential investors run for the hills. Linda's reaction was immediate and explosive. She screamed at me, throwing whatever she could get her hands on, but I didn't flinch. I let her rage, her fury washing over me like a storm against a cliff. She didn't realize that every scream, every curse she hurled at me only fueled my resolve. "You ruined everything," she shouted, voice raw. Why would you do this?" "Because I'm done being your fool," I said softly, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Because you took everything from me, my trust, my family, and you thought you could get away with it." Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. And maybe she was. The man who'd loved her, who'd trusted her, was gone. I'd killed him the moment I'd decided to fight back. "Is Emily even mine?" I asked quietly, the question hanging in the air like a noose. Linda flinched, her eyes darting away. She didn't answer, and that silence was all I needed to know. The wound was still raw, but I pushed it aside. That was something I'd deal with later, when I wasn't knee-deep in my revenge. I left Linda alone in the wreckage of our living room, her sobs echoing behind me. There was still one more move to make. Final steps, I drove to Robert's office, watching from a distance as men in suits filed into the building. Federal agents, no doubt. His employees buzzed around like bees in a disturbed hive, their frantic movements betraying their confusion and fear. I imagined the chaos that would greet Robert when he arrived, the shock that would cross his face as they laid out the charges against him. Good. I'd made sure to time my visit perfectly. As I waited, Robert's car pulled up. He stepped out, his confident stride faltering as he took in the scene. Even from where I sat, I could see the panic in his expression. It was time for the final blow. I got out of my car and walked over to him. He looked up, surprise flickering across his features. Then suspicion darkened his eyes. "James," he greeted cautiously, "what are you doing here?" I just wanted to see your face when it all came crashing down, I replied smoothly. What the hell are you talking about? I leaned in, keeping my voice low. I know everything, Robert. Every lie, every affair, every dollar you stole. It's over. He paled, his gaze darting to the building where agents were still entering. You did this? He whispered, disbelief etched into every line of his face. Yeah, I said softly. I did. For a moment, he just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Then the fight returned to his eyes, his jaw clenching in anger. You're going to pay for this, he snarled. I'll make sure of it. Maybe, I said, shrugging, but by the time you do, you'll have nothing left. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. He called after me, his voice growing shrill, but I didn't look back. There was nothing more to say. Linda's final move. By the time I got home, Linda had packed a bag. She stood by the front door, her face pale and drawn. I'm leaving, she said flatly. I figured you would. I'll fight you for Emily, she warned, her voice breaking. I'll make sure you never see her again. I felt a pang of pain at her words, but I forced myself to stay calm. Do whatever you think you need to, Linda, but I'm not the one who's going to end up alone. She stared at me, hatred burning in her eyes. Then she turned and walked out the door. Emily. That night I sat down with Emily. I knew she deserved the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to shatter her world completely. Not yet. Not until I knew for sure. Dad, is everything okay? She asked, her eyes wide with worry. Things are going to be different, sweetie, I said softly. But I promise, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. I pulled her into a hug, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Linda and Robert were finished, but at what cost? I wasn't the man I used to be. The revenge had changed me, twisted me into something I barely recognized. But I'd won. That was all that mattered, Bud. Wasn't it? I knew I couldn't let things end quietly. Robert and Linda had taken everything from me, my marriage, my trust, even the question of my daughter's paternity. I needed closure, and that meant confronting them head-on, exposing every last lie and betrayal. A week after the news about Robert broke, I arranged for the confrontation. It wasn't hard. All it took was a single message from me to Linda, asking her to meet me at our house to discuss Emily's future. I knew she'd bite, if only out of fear of what else I might be planning. Robert, of course, would come along, thinking he could somehow control the situation. But this time, I held all the cards. When they arrived that evening, I was waiting for them in the living room. The house was dark, shadows stretching across the walls like accusations. Linda looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, messy knot, and dark circles framed her eyes. Robert stood behind her, his jaw clenched, eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He'd lost weight since our last encounter. I imagined he hadn't been eating much lately. James, what's this about? Linda asked cautiously, her voice strained. I gestured for them to sit. Relax. This is just a little family meeting. Robert scoffed, but Linda nudged him forward. They took seats across from me, the tension between us crackling like static electricity. Let's not waste time, I began, my voice steady. We all know why we're here. It's time for the truth to come out, don't you think? What the hell do you want, James? Robert snapped, his patience fraying. If this is some pathetic attempt to— Shut up, I cut in, my gaze locking onto his. You don't get to talk. Not anymore. He recoiled slightly, but I didn't give him time to recover. I turned to Linda, meeting her wary eyes. Do you want to tell him, or should I? Linda blinked, confusion clouding her features. Tell him what? About the paternity test. I watched her face crumble as the words hit her. About how you were planning to leave me for Robert. And of course, about the little mishap regarding Emily's real father. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Robert shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between us. What the hell is this? He muttered. It's a game we're all done playing. I tossed a folder onto the coffee table, the papers inside spilling out slightly. Everything's in there, Robert. The affair, the paternity test results. Even your financial records. I made sure the authorities got a copy, but I thought you'd like to see it all laid out. Robert leaned forward, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. His face paled as he read, and for a moment, I almost felt a twinge of pity. Almost. James, I didn't, he stammered, but I cut him off again. Don't bother. I looked at Linda, whose eyes were wide and glassy. Tell me, Linda, when did you decide to betray me? Was it before or after you realized you'd married a man who actually loved you, who wanted to build a life with you? Was I just a stepping stone to get to someone more exciting? She flinched, tears spilling over her cheeks. It wasn't like that, James. It just happened. Just happened? I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? I waved at the mess of papers on the table, the ruin of our lives, was some accident? You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew what it would do to me. James, she started, but I couldn't listen to her excuses anymore. The words were empty, hollow, devoid of the remorse I so desperately wanted to see. You planned this, Linda. Every lie, every cover-up. You knew what it would do to Emily. You knew what it would do to me. And still, you went through with it. Because I love him, she burst out suddenly, her voice breaking. I love Robert. I've always loved him. And Emily, she deserves to know who her real father is. The words hung between us, raw and devastating. I'd suspected it for a long time, but hearing her say it, hearing her admit it out loud, it was a different kind of pain. One I hadn't been prepared for. Robert cleared his throat, trying to insert himself into the conversation. Look, James, we didn't want it to go this way. Stop talking, I snarled, fury surging through me. You don't get to play the victim here. You took my family from me. You took everything I thought I knew about my life and tore it apart. And now you're going to pay for it. His eyes narrowed and he sat up straighter, a flicker of defiance in his gaze. And what do you think you can do, huh? You think you're some mastermind, pulling the strings? This isn't over, James. I still have resources. I still have power. Not for long, I murmured, my lips curling into a cold smile. Did you really think I'd let you walk away from this unscathed? Your company's already under investigation. Your reputation's in tatters. And soon you'll have nothing left. I'll make sure of it. His face twisted in rage, but before he could respond, I turned back to Linda, forcing myself to stay calm. I want you to understand something, Linda, I said softly. I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm not even doing it out of revenge. I'm doing it because you took my daughter and made me doubt everything. You made me believe she wasn't mine. She's still your daughter, James, Linda pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. Please don't take her away from me. Don't you dare use her against me, I snapped, the rage bubbling up again. You've already done enough. You're going to lose her, Linda. You're going to lose everything. And I won't feel an ounce of regret. James, please, Robert tried to interject, but I silenced him with a glare. Save it, Robert. You're finished. Everything you built, everything you tried to take, it's all gone. For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of my words pressing down on us like a physical force. Then Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This isn't over, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. I'll fight you, James. I'll find a way to make you pay. I tilted my head, studying him. You don't get it, do you? You've already lost. There's no way out of this. The only thing you can do now is watch everything you've built crumble. Emily will hate you for this, Linda whispered, her voice trembling. She'll hate you for tearing our family apart. She'll hate you more, I countered coldly. When she finds out what you did, how you lied to her, she'll see you for who you really are. And that, Linda, is something I'll never forgive you for. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I felt a pang of something. Grief, perhaps, for what could have been. For the life we'd once had. But it was gone now, shattered beyond repair. I stood slowly, looking down at them, Two broken people who tried to destroy me. Two people who thought they could take my life and turn it into a lie. I'm done, I said softly. I'm done being your fool. You wanted to ruin me? Well, congratulations. You succeeded, but I won't go down alone. I turned and walked away, the sound of Linda's sobs following me like a ghost. I felt a strange sense of detachment, of calm settling over me. I'd done what I set out to do. I'd exposed them, stripped them of everything they valued. But as I walked out of the house, a nagging thought gnawed at the back of my mind. It'd go, what now? I had destroyed them, but in the process, I destroyed a part of myself too. The part that had believed in love, in family, in trust. It was gone, replaced by something darker, colder. I stepped outside, the cool evening air washing over me. I breathed deeply, trying to ground myself, to find some sense of peace. But there was none, only emptiness. The days after the confrontation blurred together. I moved through them in a haze, numb to everything except the heavy silence that filled the house. There were no more angry phone calls, no more screaming matches, just quiet, empty rooms that felt more like a tomb than a home. Linda moved out within a week. I didn't fight her on it. The house was just a reminder of everything that had gone wrong, every broken promise, every shattered dream. Emily stayed with me, at least for the time being. She didn't ask why her mother left so suddenly, and I didn't offer an explanation. I didn't know what to say, how to put the nightmare into words a 14-year-old could understand. How could I tell her the truth without ruining her perception of everything she knew? I didn't want to talk, but the silence was suffocating. One evening, I found myself staring at a family photo that still hung on the wall. Linda's smile was wide and carefree, her arm wrapped around me, Emily squeezed between us. We looked happy, content, a perfect family. It was a lie, every smile, every memory, tainted by the truth I'd uncovered. I couldn't take it anymore. I ripped the picture off the wall, hurling it across the room. The glass shattered, the frame splintered, but it didn't bring me any relief, just more broken pieces to pick up. The rage ebbed, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. I sank to the floor, the fragments of glass and wood scattered around me like the wreckage of my life. It was over. I'd destroyed them. Linda, Robert, their plans for a new life together, but I'd destroyed myself in the process. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone consumed by vengeance and bitterness. I'd won, but it felt like losing. Consequences. It took weeks for the fallout from my actions to settle. Robert's company spiraled into chaos as more of his fraudulent dealings came to light. The FBI was all over him, subpoenas flying left and right. His investors pulled out, his board members turned against him, and the media tore him apart. Everything he'd built was crumbling, just as I'd promised. I watched it unfold from a distance, the reports playing on the news like some twisted victory parade. I should have felt satisfaction. Instead, there was just a hollow emptiness. Linda tried to fight back, of course. She hired a lawyer, demanded visitation rights, claimed I was alienating Emily. I didn't engage in the mudslinging. I let my attorney handle it, maintaining a cold professional distance. I could have destroyed her reputation too, exposed the affair publicly, made her the villain in the court of public opinion. But I didn't. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. Whatever the reason, I let her walk away with what little dignity she had left. Emily, caught between us, became quieter, more withdrawn. She stayed in her room most days, avoiding the questions from friends and teachers. I knew she was struggling to process it all, but every time I tried to talk to her, I saw the same guarded expression in her eyes, the same wariness I'd seen in Linda's. I'd become someone she couldn't reach, and she was pulling away from me, one careful step at a time. One afternoon, I knocked on her door. She looked up from her desk, a hint of apprehension flickering across her face. "Can we talk?" I asked gently. She nodded, closing her laptop. "Sure, Dad." I sat on the edge of her bed, unsure of where to start. "I know things have been hard lately, and I haven't been the best at explaining what's going on." "It's okay," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I know you and Mom are..." I know things are bad. I swallowed, the words sticking in my throat. Your mom and I, what happened between us isn't your fault, Emily. I just want you to know that. No matter what. She nodded slowly, but her eyes remained distant. I hated that look. The way it made me feel like a stranger in my own daughter's life. I'm trying, I continued, forcing the words out. I'm trying to be the dad you deserve, but I know I've messed up. And I'm sorry. Her lip trembled, but she quickly bit it, holding back whatever she wanted to say. I waited, giving her time. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I almost missed it. Are we going to be okay? The question hung between us, raw and fragile. I wanted to tell her yes, that everything would be fine, that we'd move past this and be happy again. But I couldn't lie to her, not after everything. We'll be okay, I said quietly, but it's going to take time. She nodded again, but I could see the doubt lingering in her eyes. I'd lost her trust, just as I'd lost Linda's, and it would take more than a few apologies to rebuild it. Moving forward, the weeks turned into months. I found myself slipping into a routine that felt both familiar and foreign. I went to work, managed my company, made small talk with colleagues. But it was like I was operating on autopilot, going through the motions without really being present. It was Emily who finally broke through the fog. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, she came in and sat beside me. I want us to talk to someone, she said softly, her fingers twisting in her lap. Someone? Yes? I asked confused. A therapist, she clarified, meeting my gaze with a steadiness that surprised me. For us? Together. I blinked, taken aback. I'd never considered therapy, never thought I needed it. But looking at her, seeing the vulnerability and determination in her expression, I realized it wasn't just about me. It was about us, about rebuilding what had been broken. All right, I said slowly. If that's what you want, we'll do it. She let out a breath, relief washing over her features. Thank you, Dad. Acceptance of change therapy wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't like flipping a switch and suddenly feeling whole again. It was hard, uncomfortable, forcing me to confront things I'd buried deep inside. The anger, the guilt, the sense of betrayal that still simmered beneath the surface. But it helped. Slowly, bit by bit, I began to piece myself back together. Emily opened up too, sharing her fears, her confusion. We talked about Linda, about Robert, about what it all meant for us. Some days were better than others, but we were making progress. We were healing. Linda tried to reach out a few times, but I kept my distance. She wasn't part of our lives anymore. Not really. I'd made my choice and she'd made hers. I wasn't interested in rekindling old wounds. I focused on Emily. On being there for her, on proving that I could be the father she needed, even if I hadn't been the husband Linda needed. We took small steps, shared dinners, weekend trips, little moments that reminded us both that we still had each other, that despite everything, we were still a family. Embracing the future one evening after months of therapy and tentative conversations, Emily and I stood in front of the house. It was empty now, stripped of furniture, the walls bare. We'd decided to sell it and move somewhere new, a fresh start. Ready? I asked, glancing at her. She nodded, a small smile curving her lips. Yeah, I think so. We locked the door one last time and walked away. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as if I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind the pain and bitterness that had consumed me for so long. As we drove away, I glanced at Emily. Her expression was peaceful, calm. The tension that had lingered between us for so long seemed to have eased, replaced by something lighter, something hopeful. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still nights when the memories came rushing back, sharp and painful. But there was also something new, a sense of possibility, of hope. I'd spent so long consumed by revenge, by the need to destroy what Linda and Robert had tried to take from me. But in the end, it wasn't about them. It was about finding a way to move forward, to let go of the bitterness and embrace the future. And that's what I intended to do. As we crossed the city limits, the sun setting behind us, I reached over and squeezed Emily's hand. We're going to be okay, I said softly, meaning it this time. She smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. Yeah, Dad, we will. The road stretched out ahead of us, open and filled with possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to see where it led.